Who, when you were a kid, who were the adults that were around?
Okay, the adults that were around were Mom and Dad, and then there was Grandma Heacock. That was Fannie Knowles Heacock, and then Joseph Wilson Heacock was my grandfather, and they were pretty young and vital when I was a little kid. And then there was Aunt Augusta and Grandma Sterling. That's Augusta Sterling, and Alice Sterling. They lived right through the orchard from us, and it was easy to get to their house. So, we ran barefoot down there, Fanny and I, to spend the night, or Dorothy and I, before Fanny came along. But we had a small house, and so we really needed the extra parenting that was given to us. And my grandfather, Sterling, had passed away in 1935, and so I was just 35 or 36, but I was too little to remember him. But Dad told a lot of stories about him, so I always felt like he was part of the household because my dad admired his father so much.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about the setting real quick. Where exactly was this? If you could just describe the town and
yes, this was very rural. An interesting thing came up recently about my Social Security. They called me back and said, we need additional information. What town were you born in? And I said, I wasn't born in town. I was born in the country. So, the computer wanted to know exactly what town, and so it was interesting. She said, okay, I know how to fix that. But we lived 4.5 miles from Edinburgh, from the courthouse. Mm-hmm. And we lived on a road called Monmac Road. It was not paved, and we did not have electricity. We did not have a phone. And so we were really out there in the boondocks. When we started going to school, we walked to Monte Cristo Road, which was north of us, and we caught the McCook school bus. And so we left really early in the morning. And from Monte Cristo Road north of Edinburgh, it was all brush. And so the coyotes would howl, and the moon is shining early in the morning when we had to catch the bus. So it was kind of scary when we were little bitty kids. But I was in that little house in the country when we did get electricity and when we did get a telephone. And the way we got electricity, you had to be able to pay for the pole. And so if you could pay for the pole when it came down your road, you could get electricity. So, it was a participation thing. Mm. And it was really a big deal because that meant we didn't have to have the ice man deliver ice to the house anymore because we could get a refrigerator with electricity.
Okay.
So those made a big difference in our lives. We no longer had to have a radio with a huge battery. The radio was small, but the battery was huge. And so we could go ahead and get a radio that you could plug in the wall. And so it meant lots of changes. We no longer had kerosene lamps that we had to clean the globes every Saturday. We had to get newspaper and clean that black off of the globes of the kerosene lamps. And so, there were lots of changes by having electricity. And especially the phone. We were on what they called a party line. And I don't know how many families were on that party line. but there was incessant talking. You picked up the phone, and before you started dialing and ringing, you had to go ahead and find out if anybody else was on the line. And so when Mom had an emergency, she would tell them, and they all knew she had a bunch of kids, and she had an emergency, so everybody would get off the line so Mom could use it. But those were the kinds of things that we did for entertainment. On Sunday afternoon, Dad would make ice cream, and that was really a big deal because ice was precious. And so we had lots of milk and cream from cows, and we had eggs that laid eggs. So we had milk and cream and eggs, and so all we needed was ice and ice salt for the freezer, and Dad would churn, and we'd sit on that. But we played games, and we played games with our cousins. Aunt Dorothy and Uncle Lee Bear were really important in our lives too, and the kids. There was Howard, that was Bruce's age approximately, and Dorothy and Margie Bear were the same age, just almost exactly, and Dwayne and I were the same age, and then Jimmy and Winfield were good friends. So, the Bear kids all had somebody their age to go ahead and play with. So it was great. So we would play kick the can and jump rope and ante over and stuff like that. But no air conditioning. We never did get air conditioning.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that, because the Edinburgh in the summertime can just be brutal.
It was brutal, and we would sweat because we would be outside. It was too hot to be in the house. Mm-hmm. And the house was very small. The house was a small living room that had a Franklin stove in it to go ahead and heat the house. And then it had a bedroom, it had a closet, and in the bathroom we had a toilet and a lavatory, but we didn't have a shower or a tub. And then we had a small kitchen, and so the house was very small. And so we were busting at the seams at all times, and so we spent our time outside. And the schools were not air conditioned. The school buses were not air conditioned. The house surely wasn't air conditioned. But, one of the things we had was a garage, and it was a wooden garage, and we took over the garage, and we had the wooden floor in the garage was actually for laundry, but we used it as a stage, and so we put on plays, and we did all kinds of stuff in that garage. And then behind the garage, we had a kind of a palapa out there, a cover, and Mom had her washing machine outside. And it was, the first one we had was gasoline operated, I think. And it was a lot of work to do laundry. That's all there is to it. But, when it was so hot, we had flies and gnats. The gnats would come, and we were constantly slapping gnats because they loved sweat. And we had a lot of it.
Right.
Oh, my gosh, I remember all of those things.
Wow. So I guess that's,
yeah, let me just go ahead and say that one of the things about our health, Mom was always very, very conscious of her as a nurse and a doctor. She was amazingly good about it. She gave us vitamins and poked castor oil down our throat and things like that. But we had things like ringworm, and we had boils. I had styes on my eyes. We had lice in our hair. We would catch it from kids on the school bus, and so it was just a constant battle of these little things. And then because we went barefoot, we had thorns in our feet and cuts on our feet, and so we always had a lot of doctoring. It seemed like that Mom had to do because we were rough and tumble.
Mm.
Not
Yeah,
saying
so
that has changed.
So what was the medical situation like? Who was the like? I take it that there was a family doctor, but
right.
How close would
the family doctor was in Edinburgh, so he was approximately 4.5 miles away. Dad and Mom had a car. The vehicle was very, very important for us. And, when I was born, Dr. Hom came out to the house and delivered me. And we had a nurse that was a neighbor, and she came and took care of Mom and me when I was born. And that's kind of the way it was. Her name was Nurse Gormley, and she was important because she came to help Mom when she had a baby. And Fanny came just 14, 15 months after I was born. So she needed care, and you had to have help. So we had a nurse that would come and help Mom, and so we were really lucky. But I was born at home, and Dr. Hom delivered me. I don't know how he got the message that Mom was in labor, but I think Bruce and Dorothy were both born at the hospital in Edinburgh. We did have a hospital. It was a nice brick hospital, and when Dorothy had her appendix out, well, that's where she went. But I remember things like Dad having a tooth that was pulled, and it was a red socket. I mean, he started bleeding, and Mom could drive the car, and she got Dad in that car and gave him a pail to go ahead and bleed into, and she took off for town. And, she had to make arrangements for Aunt Augusta to come and help, and whatever help she could get for the kids, because she had to be an ambulance. So I remember those things really well. But Dad left the house real early in the morning to go farm. And he had, when I was a little kid, we had mules. And he had 2 mules, Jerry and Maud, I think. And he would use a plow, and those 2, he was a tall, good-looking farming guy, and he loved it. He loved working with those mules. He loved the animals. We always had cows to go ahead and help us give milk. And when Bruce was born, he had pigs. And to take the pigs to market, he had to take them all the way to San Antonio to sell them at the market in San Antonio. So that was a big deal.
Wow.
And he didn't continue doing that. No more pigs.
Yeah, that's a long way to take a pig.
Yeah, it is.
How would he have hauled pigs up to San Antonio?
I do not know how he hauled them. I'm sure another farmer helped him that might have had a truck or a trailer that could be pulled behind. That he sold the crop. He sold the piglets. He wouldn't sell the mama sow. The mama sow was always important. But at some point in time, he sold the mama sow and didn't have pigs anymore. But, you just sold the fruit of the labor.
Right.
So anyway, that's kind of the way it was when I was a kid. And Grandma and Aunt Augusta lived through the orchard. We had an orchard to the west of us and to the south of us. And Grandma lived through the orchard, and they had lots of chickens. We had chickens too, but they had a lot more chickens, and they had more cows to milk, I think, than Dad did. So that's how Aunt Augusta earned the living, was from selling milk and selling cream, selling eggs, and from time to time butter. So, yeah, that's how she earned her income to survive.
Wow.
And Golden Jersey Creamery would drive out and pick up the cans of milk and take them to Edinburgh, and once a month they would get a check from Golden Jersey Creamery. And they made their living doing things like that.
And what did
yeah, go ahead.
What did Grandpa grow? What was he? What did he?
Okay, Charlie Sterling. He grew tomatoes. He grew grain. And when we were little, you know, when you have animals to feed, you had to grow the feed for the animals. The barn was at Aunt Augusta's and Grandma Sterling's house, and so they would bring feed to go ahead and feed the cows when they milked them, and they would buy that food in Edinburgh at Piper Feed and Seed. But Dad mainly did, you know, it was small farming then because it was just a 20-acre tract of land for both of them. So there was citrus on it, and then what I remember is tomatoes and grain. I don't think he grew anything else. The grain was mainly to feed the cattle. But then when we moved into our house, our bigger house that was built in the 40s, I think I was 10 or 11 when we moved into that house. And so our life changed drastically then. Then, you know, with 900 acres, Dad planted lots and lots of fields of green beans and corn and tomatoes, lots of tomatoes, and lots of grain that they ground up and made silage for the cattle. And he had started, before he moved, he had started a herd of cattle, and then he took those wild cows and he started breeding Santa Gertrudis bulls, and so he ended up with a Santa Gertrudis herd of cattle. And they were much hardier in the valley than the Herefords were. But we had Jersey cows that we milked, and I think all of our cows that were in the milking stream were Jerseys.
Wow. So, what was school like?
Oh gosh.
That time?
We went to a school, elementary school, with Sam Houston. And Sam Houston School now is closed, boarded up. They would like to restore it because it is right across the street from what is now City Hall. Many of our teachers lived in a teacher's house. It was just really interesting because they had, it was a rooming house for teachers, basically. And so the teachers could go ahead and walk down to school and teach. And but these had to be pretty much single. There were some married teachers there, but they didn't have children. And so, the windows had to open. It was hot in the summer and hot when school started, and it got cold waiting for the school bus in those mornings because usually it was dark. And so we'd wear coats to school in the cold of the morning. In the afternoon it'd be so warm we'd forget our coats and leave them at school. We took our lunches to school. Later, we would have a cafeteria and could buy our lunch. Lunches were not free. There wasn't anything like breakfast. And most of the kids were rural. We had kids coming from Hartgill and McCook, and those were where in those schools they had elementary schools, but they didn't have high schools. They didn't have junior high schools, so those kids had to ride the bus and come to school. But we went through the third grade at Sam Houston School, and then we went, started fourth. I think that was the way it was, fourth, fifth, and sixth, and seventh and eighth, and then after that we went to high school. But basically junior high and high school were the same building. They were just different parts of the building, and multi-storied and brick. And those are still there, and they are now pretty much administrative buildings. But when you restore those buildings, they're really nice. They have air conditioning, and so they made them habitable now. But no, we had to have windows that opened, and we just tolerated the heat. And so that's where we were.
Wow. And how large were how large was the school and the classes, and were people in different grades all combined? I take it this was rural.
We had
semi-rural.
We had separate classes. We didn't have a one-room schoolhouse. First graders were together, and I don't know, probably we didn't have that many kids in a classroom, maybe 20. But I remember when I was in second grade, my mother was a room mother. And that was really a big deal because she would pick oranges and she would, bring them to school. And I don't remember what else she brought. I don't know if she did cookies or anything like that, but she brought fruit to us, and she was a constant participant in PTA. And after all of Mom's kids left home, she was an honorary PTA. They still wanted her to come to those meetings because she knew so much. Yeah. My mother had been a teacher before she married, and she was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse down on the Rio Grande River area. And so the children spoke no English, and the rule then was that she could speak no Spanish. She could speak Spanish, but she could understand the kids, and so she taught and started teaching them English using pictures. And then she and Dad married in 1928, and she didn't teach anymore.
Yeah, so I guess we could spend a couple of minutes talking about your parents and what they were like when you were a kid.
It really is interesting because it had to be a cultural change. Mom had moved to the Valley in 1912. She was 8 years old at that time. And she had older siblings. And then she had one or two that were born in Edinburgh. But Mary and Dorothy was older. Aunt Dorothy was older, and Aunt Mary was younger. But the three girls were in the middle of boys. And so that was really, really nice. Those three were really good friends and could do things together. The whole family was musical, and Grandpa Heacock had the hardware store on the square in Edinburgh. It was called Heacock Hardware, and across the street he had a bandstand, and he was the band director for the city of Edinburgh, and it was a town band. And so all the Heacock kids, my mother included, were all very musical. They all read music, and they played instruments, and they all sang. And so they grew up like that. My dad, Charlie Sterling, moved to Edinburgh in 1920. And when they arrived, they had purchased land, and they had been promised irrigation water so that they could start farming. Well, the canals weren't built yet. So there was no irrigation water for, your grandpa to go ahead and farm. So their lives had to be remanufactured. Coach from Edinburgh High School came out to talk to the folks and say, if Charlie hasn't finished high school, we sure would like for him to come. He was 6'4", and they sure needed him to come and help play basketball. So my dad went back to school to finish high school, but the main reason was to go ahead and play basketball, which he did very well. And so we have stories about him going to state with his team, and he said, it's the first time we had shoes, and we had a wood court to play on. We had never played on a court, and we'd never played in shoes. So he said, we lost. We didn't know how to play on wood. But he was a good basketball player and really enjoyed it. My mother and Dad were in high school together, and that's where they met. And Mom, as a junior in high school, was president of her class. And, I don't know how many kids were in school. I don't remember now, but it was, a small graduating class. Aunt Augusta was in the class. Let's see, I think she was in Mom's class, and she was valedictorian of the class. But our dad was the jovial basketball player. The mayor of Edinburgh at that time had a car. Nobody had cars. And Dad knew how to drive, and so he was allowed to drive the mayor's daughter to functions in Edinburgh, Texas. So Dad at 6'4" was kind of a standout. Nobody was that tall. And he was very good looking. Mom was very good looking. They were beautiful people. But our mother was 5'2", and Dad was 6'4". So, yeah, it was a big variation in height. She could stand under his arm.
Wow. So how old were they when you were, like, let's say 10, when you first moved into the new house?
Okay.
I guess describe the whole family at that point in time.
Yeah. Okay. When we moved, all the children had been born by the time we moved. So, Brother Peter was a baby, but it was Bruce and Dorothy. They were born before me. I was born in 1933. Dorothy was born in 31, and Bruce was born in 29. And then there was Fanny. Fanny was born in, 35. And Winnie was born in, 36, 37, But it was Winnie, and then a few years went by, and then Scott, Ruth, John, and Peter were born. And Peter was little when we moved into the new house. So really, I don't think Ruth, John, and Pete remember much about the old house, if they remember anything at all, because, and Scott tells it this way, he says, you know, Bruce always thought we were terribly poor because we had such a tiny place. And Scott, when he grew up, he thought we were rich because we had a bigger house than anybody else. So it just depended on the time that you were born as to what you thought about, you know, your life.
Right. So how did that move happen? Like what did they just save up money and buy a new place and new land, or what?
Well, it was a partnership that developed with my dad and Frank Rising. So Rising Sterling Ranch was developed. It was Rising Sterling Farm and Ranch. And when that happened, Frank Rising was the partner with financial benefits, but my dad was the one with the knowledge. So Frank Rising had a construction company in Edinburgh, and he did a lot of underground drainage with concrete pipe, and built canals and things for the irrigation of, we had to all irrigate. All the farmers had to irrigate, and so those canals had to be built. Underground drainage had to be built, and he did that.
Yeah, and you see those all over the valley. There's a lot of those concrete drainage ditches. So.
Right. So anyway, Daddy did the farming, and he was really good in the cattle business. He knew how to buy. For some reason or other, he really knew a lot about cattle, and so he could buy bulls. Winnie and I had the privilege of going with Dad to buy bulls at different ranches, and that was really a lot of fun. I don't know why we were selected, but I guess we were the right size and whatever. But we would go buy a new bull because to breed, you didn't want, the same bull to breed his children. You wanted a different bull. So Dad was really good about the heritage of all the animals. He knew what calf came from what cow, and what that heritage was in the whole herd. He could name the whole livelihood of each one of those animals. It was very, very interesting. But he grew grain, and when they would grind it up, we had underground silos. And so in the summer, you had cotton to deal with, and the grain came before the cotton was ready to harvest. And so we had to have lots of help to go ahead, because everything was done by small tractors, small ensilage cutters, and trucks that could drive the ensilage down into those underground storage areas, and then those would be covered over with tarps and with dirt, and to go ahead and ferment, and that would be the winter feed for the cows. And we had Mexico, from Mexico we had people come, braceros some of the time, to go ahead and help with the cotton harvest, because that was labor intensive. And it was hot, but we didn't have such a thing as a cotton picker. So, everything was manual. Lots of hoes. At the ranch, area. They had a big implement shed, and then they had houses built for several of our workers. They were couples there, and they raised their children there, and so it was quite an operation. And we provided the houses, and the water source was the canal. And they thought they died and went to heaven because they had a floor in their house, and they had running water from the canal. So it was a privilege to have them there because they really were good workers. But they were over closer on Frank Rising's property down from their house. And Dad and Mom owned their own 15 acres across the road from the main ranch.
Wow. So
that's how we migrated from that tiny house, because the partnership developed. And, you know, I never knew how that happened, but it was a good partnership.
Yeah, and how much longer was the family farming in that location? I mean, I know that by the time that I was growing up, you know, all the family operations moved to Schulenburg.
Right.
What I guess. So what happened?
When my dad was 65 years old, the farm had been disbanded. Frank Rising's construction business failed, and he admitted bankruptcy, and so it took the farm also. Dad had been driving the tractor, and he had fallen on his left shoulder, and he wasn't paralyzed, but he was totally unable to work. And so he was in the house constantly, and Mom was never used to that. And she called me one day, and she said, you know, your dad is going to sit here and die. He is so depressed because he hurts so bad, and he cannot work. So what are we going to do? And that, you know, it was interesting because I was a banker, and I had heard of opportunities for people like Dad who had retired and basically wanted to work. And so I ran across this ad in the newspaper, the San Antonio newspaper, and they wanted a manager for a small ranch up in the hill country just north of San Antonio. It was at Spring Branch, Texas. And Spring Branch mainly was very much a hole in the road, but they did have a post office, so it was Spring Branch. And the closest town to Spring Branch was Blanco. And but this little ranch, I called them. I talked to Dad and Mom, and so I called and made an appointment with Frank Stanish in San Antonio, and they gave me directions out to the ranch. And so I took Mom and Dad, and we went up there, and Dad interviewed with the Stanishes, both Mr. and Mrs. Stanish, and they were so sweet, and they had a ranch house that looked down on the Guadalupe River and all those gorgeous trees along the river. It was a sight to see. But the ranch he had cattle, and it was hilly and rocky and totally different kind of place than Dad had ever worked. And, of course, he had a boss, too, and he really never had a boss before. But Dad was there for, I would say, a decade, something like that, about a decade. And, yeah, it was great. And Sterling grew up going up there and working with Dad. He learned to pitch hay, and he learned to drive a Jeep when he was 11 years old and crossed the creek and went up to the hay meadow. And, it was just really fascinating, the things that they did. They had horses and cattle, and Sterling loved going up there in the summers when he was a little kid. He started going when he was 10, I think. But that's how Dad left. And then when Bruce started buying all the 40-acre tracts in Schulenburg, Dad just couldn't do as much work at the ranch anymore, and so he moved Mom and Dad to a house over in Schulenburg, and that's how they got to Schulenburg.
Okay. Interesting. All right, so I guess let's rewind and go back to when you left the house, when you first left the house as a young adult.
Okay.
Tell me the story around that, and what happened in your young adult years.
Okay, when I was in, our lives growing up in the house at the ranch, we were so busy. Dorothy and Fanny and I sang in a trio, and we were the Sterling sisters, and we sang a lot. Mom played the piano, and so we would practice. We would cook supper every night, and we practiced our music and sang and fixed a big dinner every night. On Saturdays, Dad would go to the bank, and we'd go to Piggly Wiggly grocery store, and we would stock up on the groceries for the week. You didn't go to town for a loaf of bread. You had to be prepared. So we had a freezer, and we had a lot of beef in the freezer. We had loaves of bread. But Mom took care of everything during the day, and at night we would go ahead and cook. I think Fanny and Winnie and the group really missed us when Dorothy and I were gone, because they had all of it to do them then after that. But the year that I graduated from high school in 1952, and we were all of us were active in school. Sergeantettes, we marched in the sergeantettes, and we did choir, and we did musicals, and pretty much Dorothy, Fanny, and I did. And so when I graduated from high school in 1952, that summer I stayed home and I took care of the house. Sonny had already gone to New Orleans. He was working by then. And I took care of the house and cooked a big lunch every day for everybody that was staying at the house. Winnie, and there was Terry Sterling, our cousin from Kansas, and Howie, and all of these people that were there to help on the farm. I don't remember exactly how many there were, but I cooked for like half a dozen people for noon meal every day, and it was the main meal of the day. And so I practiced making bread. I practiced making ice cream. I had ice cream almost every day. And that's where I learned to go ahead and perfect rolls and breads. But I cooked lunch and dinner at night. I did all the laundry and cleaned the house, paid Mom's bills. And Fanny was up in the hill country with Mom and the little kids. Fanny was taking care of Scott, Ruth, John, and Pete. And so each one of us had our role, and Mom had a nervous breakdown, something like August. And Dad threw a mattress in the back of the pickup, and he and I think it was Winnie took off for the hill country, took Mom to a hospital, and, everybody just pitched in and did what they had to do. And but basically that summer I was at home, and we had uh, we had a busy time because they were harvesting cotton and they were harvesting grain and doing silage, and I had my hands full at the house. And Fanny has a story to tell about, that summer of 1952. She was still in high school. I had finished high school, and so she was starting high school in September. But it was really a tough time. And then I married in December of 1952, and Sonny came to the Valley. We married at the First United Methodist Church in Edinburgh, and we had a 10 o'clock in the morning wedding, and then we turned around and left and headed to New Orleans, and that was a whole new culture for me. I was not used to the Deep South. It was segregated, and it was very, very different. The black people were all new to me, and they were the most polite, gentle people I ever met. They were just absolutely lovely. But we had separate water fountains, separate restrooms, and pretty much they were, the laborers, and they helped clean, and but they were more in a servitude role, and they were all out in the sugarcane farms and that kind of manual labor. But it really changed a lot. In 15 years, it was totally, totally different. But that's when I moved there. That was the way it was. And getting married in December of 52, then that 1953, we were in South Louisiana for 3 years, and I lived in New Orleans for a year. Diana was born after we had moved to a town called New Iberia, and so that was great, because then we had a child, and I started acquiring things like a washing machine and a sewing machine. The sewing machine actually came before the washing machine. Pretty interesting. And I made my children's clothes. I made all of your mom's clothes, Diana's clothes. I made all of them. And I didn't stop sewing for her until after her freshman year of high school. But I made everything, shorts, pajamas. Anyway, it was fun. I love that sewing machine. I still have it.
So, okay, so I guess just to jump back a little bit, how did you meet Granddad?
Oh, how did I meet? Oh, I met Sonny in high school, and he moved to Edinburgh from Fort Smith, Arkansas. He grew up in Fort Smith and was born in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And then during World War II, his dad was driving big trucks for a rubber company. I don't know, Goodyear, something like that. And but he was in the war effort. But he was a driver of a truck and moved his family to Detroit, Michigan. And so anyway, after the war was over, they moved to Edinburgh, and Sonny's dad was going to manage a Gulf station right next to the courthouse, where they had a lot of truck traffic. He knew all about the trucking business and what they needed, and so he ran a Gulf gas station, and it was right next to Golden Jersey Creamery. And that station was open for a number of years, and then it was closed, and he went to work for Golden Jersey Creamery. And but yeah, so Sonny got here, and I think he was a sophomore in high school when he arrived in Edinburgh. But there were not very many bright red-headed kids in high school. He was one of probably two. And so I met him. He was a junior in high school when I met him, and I was a freshman. Yeah, and so anyway, at the end of my freshman year in high school, I started dating, and he and I started dating then. I guess I was 15 or 16, and he was, he had, he had missed a year of school because of his kidney problems, and he was bedridden for a year when he was 9 years old. So he was actually behind a grade. He and Sister Dorothy were the same age, and he should have been in her grade, but he missed a year of school, so he was a year behind her. So he graduated 2 years ahead of me, and Dorothy graduated from high school 3 years ahead of me. So anyway, that's how I met Sonny, and we dated in high school, and he went to work for an oil company called Standard Oil of Indiana, and they called it Staniland, and he did survey work, and he surveyed downtown New Orleans for oil and gas minerals, and then he went to the swamp, and he went to the lakes, and so he did offshore, and he did in town, and he did rural. It was really something, but it was hard because he'd have to walk through water, and so he would really cramp. You know, you spend all day walking through water and rubber boots up to your hip, and you'd really pay for it in your muscles. So anyway, we got used to it, and I stayed home, and I figured out how to get around New Orleans. I loved the adventure of finding my way around, learning how to ride a bus that wasn't a school bus, and public transportation. We had trolleys, and so, boy, I just took off, and I could clean our little apartment in about 30 minutes. So, you know, I didn't work. I learned my way around, and I had a really nice time. And then we had friends. We made friends, and and Sonny and I would go to their apartments, and we would go. You know, I wasn't used to having bars with stages and people performing and music, and I wasn't used to that at all. And so it was a totally different culture. I became very familiar with jazz and, you know, all the performers. Tony Bennett performed about a block away from us. And, you know, it was just really interesting. So I had a really good time. Sonny did too, but he was working and I was playing.
Right. Well, when did you move to New Iberia?
We moved to
New
Iberia. Yeah, let's see. I guess we moved. Well, Diana was born in March of 1954, and she was born in Edinburgh because Dr. Southwick said, you know, Sonny's out there on a boat, and if you have a baby, he's going to be out on a boat somewhere, and you won't see him for 3 days. So you come down here, and you come down here early. So I got to Edinburgh about the second week of March, and we had not moved. That was 1954. We had not moved to New Iberia yet. We moved after Diana was born. And so it was really interesting. I got to Edinburgh, and oh my gosh, Diana was born 3 weeks early. So the doctor was exactly right. She was a little bitty thing. So she was 5 pounds, and she had no fingernails and no toenails and no eyebrows, and yeah, she
Wow.
came out squalling, and she squalled for 6 months. She had colic so bad, and so we had lots of sleepless nights with Diane. But you know, it wasn't anything much to me because I had all the energy in the world. But it was something, and I wasn't used to swamp mosquitoes that were as big as a small hummingbird. I just was not used to that. And I used to have to cover my head with a scarf and tie it around my neck. I had to cover my face, too, to hang out clothes. And so it was really an interesting experience. But they almost carried Diana away. So I had to really wrap that child up in all that heat to keep from being eaten by those mosquitoes. But we really loved our time in South Louisiana. We made some really good friends there. And that made it easy.
So how did you end up moving back to the Valley then?
Well, Sonny took a lot of courses, educational courses, and one of them was in plant engineering, and he was able to go ahead and transfer with the same company down to Brownsville. And so we moved to Brownsville, and we lived in Brownsville for 3 years, and Sterling was born in Brownsville. And then the oil business just crashed completely. The interesting thing about Sonny's job was that he was working in a plant that manufactured synthetic gasoline. And this was a formula that was developed by the Germans in World War II. And the gasoline, when they got it in production, they had to sell it for $1.25 a gallon to make it work. And my gosh, gasoline didn't cost anything like $1.25. So there was absolutely no market for it at all. And so the plant closed, and Sonny was transferring. They had one transfer left for him, and it was going to be in Ohio. Oh, my gosh. Sonny said, I'm not moving north again. I'm not moving there. And thinking that, he could go ahead and get another job. Well, he did get another job. And we were going to move up on the coast near Bruce and Beebe. And he was hired, and we were planning on moving. We needed to go ahead and sell our house, pack up, and move. It was up close to Galveston area. And son of a gun, they called him and said, we just have one more thing for you to do, and that's to come up for a physical. So Sonny went up with a cold for a physical, and he couldn't pass the physical because his kidneys wouldn't take care of his cold infection. And they said, he was going to finish his degree in chemistry engineering at the University of Houston, and the company was going to pay for it. And if he had been in an accident and been burned in a chemistry accident, chemical accident, his kidneys wouldn't be able to pass off that infection, and he would die, and they couldn't take that responsibility. So, after all the testing, after his hiring, all of that, it was the physical that he couldn't pass, and that was a very hard time. I think he was 26 years old, and it was life-changing. So, we had to go ahead and start all over, and that was really hard. And he found a job with Texas Highway Department in Farr, and so we moved to Farr. And we lived in Farr for 10 years, and then we moved to the folks' place in Edinburgh when they moved up on the Guadalupe River into the ranch at Spring Branch. Then we moved out to the house, and we started working hard on getting the house ready for us to live in. And it needed a new roof so bad. So the first thing we did was put a new roof on the house and get central air conditioning in the house. And those two things cost $5,000. So we spent $5,000 doing that. And then next thing you know, Hurricane Beulah came and blew that new roof off. And we had the new roof flying all over. Oh, gosh. So, we had a real adventure living out there, that's for sure. But it was good for us to raise our kids out in the country.
Yeah.
You don't remember that, but
no, I don't.
Sterling and Diana were very, your mom and your Uncle Sterling were very, very fond of being out in the country. So it was good for us.
So describe your kids when they were kids.
Oh, my gosh. My mother said to me, Esther Sterling said, you need to have more children. You make such wonderful babies. I did. I had two great kids, Diana and Sterling. Minded us. I don't think I ever had to go in your mother's room, Diana's room, to wake her up 2 times ever. I'd go in to get her up in the morning, and she would just get up and get ready for school. Sterling would like to go ahead and roll over and go back to sleep. But, the kids, we put the kids to bed at a certain time at night, and they went to bed. And we got up at a certain time in the morning, and we got up. And they just minded so beautifully. Sonny could be very stern with them if they didn't. And so, it was really easy raising those kids. They were really precious. We had a lot of fun. And we went on lots of adventures, and when they were children, we went to national parks. And so we went to Yellowstone, fishing in Yellowstone Lake and hiking and bear watching and elk hunting. And, we found them through binoculars. And so the kids loved to do that. And your mom called me about 10 years ago, and she said, I just want to tell you, I'm so glad you took me to all those parks, because you know what? I couldn't go to them now. So we had great adventures. We'd hike back into lakes and see all the wild animals. It was just a fabulous thing to do. And but they grew up going to school in Farr and in Edinburgh, and they both graduated from Edinburgh High School. And then after that, we moved to McAllen, and Sterling was off to A&M. But Sterling's senior year in high school, we had an exchange student, Yoichi Kato, came and lived with us that year, and that was a great source of enjoyment for us. We got a big kick out of Yoichi, and he came when we lived in Edinburgh. And the first thing he said when he went out for a walk, he said, this is the first time I've ever been able to see horizon to horizon. He said, I said, how come? And he said, well, I live in Tokyo, and Tokyo is a concrete city. He said, I never see the sunrise or the sunset. And it was his first airplane trip of his life. And he flew into McAllen Airport. And from there, he has flown around the world in president's planes, and as he's covered the news for his newspaper in Japan, in Tokyo. He married in Washington, D.C., and we went up for his wedding. And so it was a wonderful wonderful thing to have him come and live with us for a year. So we were fortunate, you know, in raising kids. We were very, very lucky, weren't we?
Yeah. Seems like it. I mean,
it seems like it.
You could.
Well,
the only thing you could say about your kids when they were children is that they were wonderful children.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I mean, my mom loves me to death. I don't know if she'd say that about how I was.
No, she would have different stories. But, you know, Sonny was always working on the car, and one day I went out in the garage, and Sterling's about 3 years old, and Sterling is laying under his tricycle. And I said, what are you doing? And he says, I'm cleaning the ball bearings. He had the ball bearings out of the tires of his tricycle, and he was cleaning them. His dad showed him how to do it, and he was cleaning the ball bearings. I'm telling you, he wasn't big enough to ride a bicycle yet. This was his first tricycle. So, yeah, Sterling has always been able to fix things because Sonny always fixed everything. The plumbing, the refrigerator, the washing machine, and the car, and, you know, he repaired everything. This was before computers came in and screwed everything up. But anyway, and Diana, you know, she went to dancing class. I took the kids, and they went through swimming classes in FAR, and, you know, they played baseball. They did all kinds of things, but it was so interesting because they could both ride their bicycles in elementary school across Highway 83, which had no stoplight, and they could ride their bicycles to their elementary school. It was unbelievable now to even think about that.
Now I think Child Protective Services would throw you in prison.
Yeah, they would probably come and haul me away.
Let your children do that, yeah.
But I didn't start working until Sterling was in kindergarten. And after he was in kindergarten, then I went to work at the bank in FAR. And it was just a temporary thing, but I became a banker, and I was there for 34 years. I worked.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a temporary thing.
No, it wasn't too temporary, was it? Well, I found out that I was very good at it. So, you know, I was hired by another bank, and I moved to McAllen Bank, and so it was quite something, you know.
Yeah, well, tell me a little more about it. I mean, this is something that is, I don't know, I think is pretty interesting, and the place and time that you're at.
Yeah.
So tell me about your banking career.
Okay, I went to work $40 a week, and I worked 6 days a week, and they were very, very strict about my hours. I could not work more than 40 hours a week, so I needed to absolutely do my work and be gone, you know, between 3 and 3:30 in the afternoon. The bank closed at 2 o'clock, and I would need to go ahead and balance. And what I did, I started out in the lending area. and I did all the paperwork for loans and accepted payments on loans and kept the general ledger and all the notes posted. And then I had to keep track of things like insurance on vehicles and insurance on whatever the collateral was. If the collateral was stock, I needed to go ahead and keep track of the market value of the stock through the Wall Street Journal. And when the secretary for the bank was not there, I was the secretary for the bank, and I took minutes at board meetings, and I did all kinds of things that I had not expected to do. Planned the Christmas party at the country club and knew all the directors and their wives and invited them and things like that were not part of my routine job. But, you know, you did what you needed to do. And I was in one bank robbery there. And, you know.
Oh, tell me about that.
Yeah,
Wow.
I walked in the bank early one morning. My partner that I worked with that was seated next to me, I was her boss, and she was on vacation, so I had double duty. I needed to do work for both of us. So I walked into the back door of the bank at 7 o'clock in the morning. The door was open. I walk in, and I have my purse in one hand and my lunch in the other hand, and I'm opening the door with my backside. And I turn around, and there's a guy in a mask with a gun pointing right at me. He was about my height. And I looked over, and oh my gosh, there were 3 people tied up, laying face down on this cold, cold floor, and their hands were tied behind their back with wire. Oh my gosh, it was awful. And so they told this robber that they were waiting for the man who had the combination to the vault. Well, that man was the executive vice president of the bank. Luckily, when he did come, he knew the combination or half of the combination. And but he didn't come to work till 8 o'clock in the morning. This is 7 o'clock in the morning. So as people would come to the bank, he tied my hands with a scarf and put me in the women's bathroom, thinking, you know, that would be all of it. Well, that bathroom was crammed with women before the banker came to open the vault. And those young girls were shaking and shaking and shaking. And I said, you know, we have a role to play here. I said, you've gone through the FBI studies, and this is what we have to do. So we went over the criteria, the height, the color, you know, what his speech pattern was, all of these different things. What color were his shoes? What color were his clothes? You know, what did he have on? So we had it all down to a science. And the banker finally came, and they opened the vault. But before, you know, he got the girl untied to go open the vault with the executive vice president of the bank. And they got the vault open, and he has money in this box, and he's heading out the door. And this woman laying on the floor was really struggling because her hand had swelled up really, really bad with that wire. And so she was crying, and he reached down to help untie that wire, and he had a pistol in his hand. It went off, and it struck her through the wrist and through her hip. Then really panic started. We heard that gunshot in the bathroom. That's all we heard. And so the banker told him to go ahead, this woman, to go ahead and go with him. He wanted somebody to drive him. Evidently, he had no vehicle. So he abducted a young teller who had just walked in the bank, was totally clueless about what was going on. She got to her car, and she started driving, and she's out of gas. So he was angry with her. So they went to a remote place, and he had her stop the car. He took her out of the car and put her in the trunk. And he had his red mask on, and one of our customers saw what was happening, and he had a shotgun in his pickup truck. And so this robber started driving the car, and our customers took off after him. And he started shooting at the car. Well, this poor girl was in the trunk. It's a miracle she wasn't killed. But he stopped the vehicle and got his, he had been hiding money. That's what he was doing. He hid the money in the ditch. And so this customer of ours knew where the money was. And when he saw the mask on this guy's face, he went to see what the box was, picked up the cash, and then took off after him. So it was quite something. They police cornered him that morning, and about an hour later, the FBI was at the bank, and so, I did a lot of interviewing with the FBI, and then started answering phone calls, and they said, Peggy, you just handled the phone, so I did, and talked to news media and whatever. But, they gave him 25 years for that little trip.
Wow.
And they had him in jail, and we knew he was getting 25 years in jail, probably in 3 months. We knew that.
Mm.
Courts were much faster then.
Yeah.
But,
then
so I was at that bank for 10 years, had a great time. I knew everybody in town. But what I found, I was very, very good at balancing, the cash drawer. I never missed a nickel or a penny, and it was somebody else's money, and so I really learned how to do that well and quickly and accurately. And so I was hired by this was a friend of Sonny's somehow. I think they were in National Guard together, and he was in charge of hiring for lending, hiring for lending at a bank in McAllen called McAllen State Bank. And I went to work there in 1971. 1981, we sold the place in the country and moved to McAllen, and so I continued working at McAllen State Bank and became a commercial lending officer. And as far as I know, I was the only woman commercial lending officer at that time in the Valley, and so I was pretty well known. And anyway, I was a banker for 34 years, and I just went to work because I had too much energy not to.
Right. Wow. Well, sorry, I've got cats making a mess in here.
Yeah, that's normal.
Yeah. I'm also house sitting a couple of cats along with the cat that I have here. So there's two weird cats in the house, and they're about to. I have to separate them. Okay, so wow. I guess we should probably close up here. I don't want to.
Yeah, right.
I don't want to give Becky.
I think so. I think pretty much you probably learned a little bit, right?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I haven't. Most of these stories either I haven't heard or I haven't heard in a very long time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I tell you, I'm always amazed at how many people I know in McAllen, Texas, And so most of it is because of my banking. I knew so many people, and I knew them pretty well. But the interesting thing was I knew the men. I didn't always know their wives that well because I dealt on the business end of things. And so I was really fortunate to really know well all our mayors and all of our city commissioners and businessmen in the community. So, I felt really, really fortunate to know these people.
Okay. Let me look through the questions, see if there's one last one I want to ask
All right.
before we're done. Well, we touched off on all the major topics I wanted to touch off on. Is there any story that you have, or any words that you'd like to add? Anything that you think is an important part of your life that we have not really touched off on?
Yeah, one of the things that I always loved about my life was the freedom we were able to have growing up. We were given so much latitude. It was a miracle we all lived. But we had, very little tragedy. My mother and father never lost a child, which was really important to me. I grew up feeling safe. I never was fearful of anything except those big lightning storms that we used to have when I was a little bitty kid. They were so loud, and lightning would hit those palm trees out in the country, and they would flare up, and you'd look, and you'd see the palms on fire, and next day you'd go check it out, and son of a gun, that palm tree was burned to the ground. But we were really, really fortunate to have such freedom and such trust. We trusted people because you could trust them. And I think that is quite a heritage. So that's my story.
That's remarkable. I mean, it's hard to imagine, at least for someone who's grown up in more recent times, having such a large family and, living out in the country in the valley at the time you did, and not having electricity. And so
I know, it really is something.
Yeah, and all the kids were born before you left that tiny house.
Right. All the kids were born before.
Was it just crazy those last couple of years?
Yeah, it was crazy. It really was. It was crazy. But, I was pretty much, at night, I slept down at my Aunt Augusta's and Grandma's house. And
it was just through the orchard, right?
Just through the orchard. But Aunt Augusta took care of us, and Grandma Sterling was in a wheelchair, and she had fractured her hip out in the yard. She tripped on a hanger and fractured her hip. And that's another thing about health care. You didn't do surgery on a hip. You just lived till you died, and you never could walk again. So she was in a wheelchair from that time forward, and Aunt Augusta had to take care of her. So, that happened after we had moved, luckily. So, but Grandma was fragile. She had terrible arthritis, and so she got around very carefully. But she lived to be 95 years old, so it was a long life for her. She died before Sterling was born. She died in like 1955, I think. and Diana was born in 54.
But,
So, yeah, that was a timeline. Well, honey, I think we're wrapping it up, okay?
I think we've got plenty of stuff here. So, well, thank you very much. This
thank
is awesome,
you, James.
and I'm glad that at least that I'm able to contribute a little something to this.
Yeah,
I can't be at the reunion myself. So.
You know how it sounds exciting. It just really doesn't sound exciting coming out of your mouth. You know, you just because I'm not sure what you're going to ask, and I'm just digging up from my memory. But yeah, we really had a great life. I feel very, very privileged to have had both parents and to have had grandparents and aunts and uncles, and I never felt unloved.